There. Hello. Hi there, and welcome to everyone who's joining us this evening. I'm Faye Max, and I'm the CEO of the Survivors Trust, and I'm joined by Danny. Danny, would you like to introduce yourself before I go through the basics of the event?
Of course, yeah. My name's Danny Downey, and I'm really delighted to be here with you all tonight. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thanks, Danny. So the point of this event is just to open up a conversation about providing a safe space for survivors to share their opinions and experiences. So that doesn't happen very often. And recently there's been a lot of controversy around a consent form which the police have issued to gain consent to have access to digital records, mobile phones and computers of rape and sexual abuse victims. So we're going to be talking about that in this event. I want to remind everyone that this is a live event, and therefore if you post comments then they're visible to everyone, so do be aware of that and remember that. Also, just to say, if we do have any inappropriate comments posted, we'll try to remove them as soon as we can. We will be looking at all of the comments and we'll reply to everyone as much as we can during this session, and if not, we will reply afterwards as well. And just to say that also we'll be posting up helplines and support for people after the event as well. Okay, so as I was saying earlier, recently the police have issued this consent form, which all police forces have adopted or are thinking of adopting, which they require rape victims to sign to say that they give consent for their telephone records to be accessed. So there's been an awful lot of media attention about this. Some of it's not been very accurate. What the CPS have said is that it's not true that everyone will have to automatically hand over their personal data on their digital devices, and it's not necessarily true that a case will be dropped if they don't agree to that. So it's only going to be considered, according to the CPS, will only be considered when it's actually relevant to a specific case. And there is explicit guidance on what that relevant material means. So there should be no intrusion unnecessarily into people's private and personal information. So at the moment, we have the highest number of rapes being reported that there have ever been. So in 2008, there were 13,096 rapes reported. In 2018, that number had gone to 53,977. So that is a huge number, and it's continuing to rise. Over that same time, the number of convictions has fallen. And I don't think there's anything that highlights more robustly the fact that our criminal justice system really doesn't work for victims of rape and sexual abuse. We don't have a system that actually allows survivors to get justice. So when coming at this time when convictions are very low, this request to survivors to hand over even more of their personal and private lives just seems like maybe a stretch too far. And even with those precautions around it, about it having to be relevant and safeguards around what information is released, I know that there is a lot of fear in survivors that their personal details are going to be shared, inappropriate sharing of that information with defence barristers and with people that have abused and assaulted them already. So often in defence of rape and sexual abuse, we see defence barristers using material that you would not consider to be something which you could criticise a person for, and yet they find ways to do that. So it's difficult to believe that the same won't happen with digital information as well. And I think there is a lot of activity, a lot of campaigning going on to try and put some safety around this for people. But I think we need to really make sure that happens, that we can protect survivors from having to be scrutinised so closely at a time when they've suffered maybe the most traumatic thing that they will experience in their lives. Danny, if I could come to you, I wondered if you had any thoughts around these consent forms and what it might mean for survivors.
I think because whilst there is a standard consent form that's distributed between forces, like with anything, there is often an open to interpretation approach, and that can always be a worry. What happens in one force doesn't always follow through in another. So in my experience, and I come from a background of working as an IDVA with domestic violence, and I'm also a childhood sexual abuse survivor, sometimes there's a degree of disparity between the way you're treated from one officer to another, or even from one force to another. So I think that for me is a huge worry.
I think that's absolutely true, and each force follows its own way. And even though there are standardised procedures, standardised training, like you say, it's interpreted differently. Each individual interprets it in their own way.
Absolutely. I saw it described as a digital strip search, which I think for me was really apt. That would certainly have been a barrier to me actually coming forward. And it was an extra barrier, but probably a huge barrier, because there's so much stuff personal to me. My phone's got a database probably 7 years old. So many personal messages, and knowing the layers that they can uncover within your phone. There's a lot of personal stuff in there between myself and my husband and myself and friends that I certainly wouldn't want to be sharing, that probably could be used, by a defence barrister should I have, reported.
Yeah, and I think there's an issue around how do you cope with that amount of data? If we're talking about 7 years of text, 7 years of photos, of videos, of emails, that's an enormous amount of data. How is it going to be possible?
I spoke to a police officer who said the average sort of phone kicks out when they examine it about 30,000 pages. So how on earth you go through that with a fine-tooth comb to find what's relevant, unless you're looking then for the very salacious stuff? You're not going to then just start looking through the minute stuff. They don't have time, so I think that's a difficulty.
Exactly, and I think that's a real worry, that information could be handed over to the defence barrister without it being scrutinised properly.
Absolutely.
Without that careful level of consideration around whether it actually is relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the fact that there are fewer police officers on the ground, there are fewer trained police officers, who actually sort of specialise in different arenas. And again, it's all down to workloads, and I think that's unfortunate. Then when it becomes a survivor or a victim, when they're going through the criminal justice sector, that then becomes very difficult. It's another layer for them to get through.
I think so, and particularly I think for younger people, because the level of activity on social media for young people, then I can't imagine how that would feel for someone handing over access to everything they've put on there for the past 5 years, maybe from quite a young age. It feels so intrusive and unnecessary.
Yeah, and I think as well with the way sometimes you might say something on one day that doesn't necessarily reflect a view or the way you feel, that can then be misconstrued 2 weeks later, a month later, a year later, again, which makes people very fearful.
Yeah. So I think it seems clear that there is a lot of unhappiness amongst survivors. I've taken calls from survivors who are very distressed at the thought that information on their phone could be used against them. And it's how do we allay those fears, and how do we ensure that survivors can have a fairer experience when they're reporting, and when they're having that investigation taking place into them.
Yeah, I think that comes down a lot to training, a lot to having appropriate professionals involving and explaining as well. I don't think any survivor has an issue. Most people understand the need to disclose stuff, but only relevant stuff. And again, it's that boundary. Where do you draw the line between that?
I think so, and I think I think you're quite right. I think survivors do understand about disclosure and know that they will have to hand over things. However, what you also come up against then is the fact that it might be 2 years before you get that back. You know, investigations these days are taking longer and longer.
Yeah.
And so to hand over your phone with all your contact details on it, your friends' phone numbers, all of the
yeah, at a time when you really need to reach out to people. I can speak from experience. In November, my Facebook crashed, and as somebody who only uses Messenger, and I had about 2,000 contacts on my Facebook page, and I suddenly couldn't get into it, and the loneliness that I felt. So I can't imagine how that would be to suddenly lose my social media and my contact list off my phone. It is so isolating. I read a report of somebody who even struggled to do their banking. So everything becomes more sensitized at a time when really you should be trying to heal and have as much support as possible.
Exactly. And I think text can be such a powerful way of accessing support.
Yeah.
If you're traumatized, if you can't even pick the phone up, usually you can send a quick text message and reach out in that way. So it seems that we need to have a process in place to support people through that. You know, if phones are going to be taken away, then maybe what we need to be doing is having a process where victims who've handed their phones in are actually given another mobile phone to
absolutely and with a degree of warning as well. And for me, if you're going to take my phone, then actually I need a week's warning so I can write down relevant numbers. I can set up a new bank thing to, so I can transfer money without it suddenly being a spur of the moment. I need your phone now, because it then feels like I'm being punished and it's a confiscation rather than I'm handing it over voluntarily.
It is. It's almost a throwback to the time when it felt like the rape victim was on trial, even at the point of reporting to the police, and it used to very much feel like that. And the police have actually made massive changes in how they respond to victims. They have trained themselves up. They've really engaged, I think, a lot in making themselves survivor focused and
absolutely,
wanting to make that experience of reporting as easy as it can be. But this process is undermining all of that work, I think.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. The women that I sort of work alongside and support on a Facebook group, we had a really hefty debate about this when it came out, and many of them said there is no way now that I would report.
Yeah,
there's categorically no way at all, because again, it's another layer of something else to be used against me, alongside the fact that my medical records are going to be hauled through the coals. The fact I've been on antidepressant before might be used against me. There's so much stuff already. You can see the fact that the reporting rate is tiny. It's no wonder when people look at the mountain you have to climb.
Exactly. There are so many barriers to that face a victim in deciding whether to report or not. What we should be doing is making that process easier, rather than putting barriers there and saying, if you don't hand over your phone, then we might not be able to go on with this case. But in reality, that's not a new thing. So in terms of access to counselling records, for example, that's been the case for a long time, that if a survivor isn't prepared to allow access to their counselling records or to their medical records often, then the decision is likely to be, well, we can't continue with this case. So it's not a new thing in those terms. And I think what that plays to is the role of the defence barrister in using that information, and you referred to that earlier on. And I think for me, that's the crucial element, because if we didn't have that adversarial system where it's based on undermining the credibility of the victim, who's then a witness at that point, so they aren't represented, they don't have representation in court. The defence barrister is free to undermine them in whatever way they can and use whatever information they're able to do that.
Yeah.
So if we did away with that, if we didn't have that adversarial system, what difference would that make?
I believe that having a specialist arena, like as we discussed, in that having a format with judges and where people do have correct representation, and there is a correct arena, as opposed to people being dragged and their past being dragged along with them, through the court system.
So and I think there's been talk in the past about having expert witnesses to talk about the impact of rape and sexual abuse, and to tackle the myths around why someone might not report immediately, or the kind of trauma symptoms that someone might experience. But if you had a specialist court, if you were in the kind of arena where it wasn't necessary to undermine a witness to get to the truth of what had happened, then we wouldn't need to be going through this, would we?
No, absolutely, and I believe that would be a much fairer way to actually sort of to take somebody through finding their justice. I think our reporting rates would actually go through the roof if people believed that they actually, for one, could come out with some sort of they would actually get a decent result, as opposed to the less than 2%, which is so much lower than the 8%. I think most cases it's about 8%. Is that right? In normal courts, about 8%, but actually 2% of cases end up with a result in court over rape, which is just it's abhorrent.
It is, and the cost of that is,
of course,
the personal cost of going through that whole process, and then sort of not finding that actually at the end of it there is a conviction is just an awful thought, really.
Yeah, and I think that actually the women I've spoken to who actually have been so strong and so brave to have actually taken the steps to actually to want to go to court, which, and they were much braver than ever I was. I salute them wholeheartedly. When they got to the end and perhaps didn't get the result they were hoping for, and not because of anything they did wrong, but the fact that something was used against them in a way it perhaps shouldn't have been, the resentfulness that they feel, and the wholehearted effects on their mental health, and their what they then say to the rest of women who it's happened to is actually don't ever do it, because actually the same might happen to you, and that's so sad.
Yes, exactly. And linked to that, it's the fact that actually there is no safeguarding them. We aren't protecting society through using the system that we've currently got.
Yeah, absolutely. I think training of judges as well. I think it's very difficult for judges to have empathy when they perhaps that they may well have a very basic training, but to say to somebody, I was once asked, well, why did you wait until you were 40 to disclose? Well, there was a whole myriad of reasons why, and I was a professional, that there was so many reasons. It was so diverse, and a friend of mine who was a police officer said, well, why didn't you disclose sooner? Because that paints you out to be a less victim. And I just thought, how strange. What a strange thing to say. They clearly had no education in trauma and memories and the whole social reasons why people don't disclose.
I think you're right, and I'm in the same situation as you. By the time I was in a position to report, then the perpetrator had passed away, so there was nowhere for me to go with that, although the information was lodged with the police. But you're sort of left in that situation, and I think you have to be kind to yourself and know that you can only do what you can do at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. I used to go into court with women that I worked with in domestic violence as an IDVA, and I would just be so in awe of what they did. And on the back of that, I would also watch the way that defence barristers took them down. And that for me was a real cognitive, I don't believe I could do that. I don't believe I'm strong enough. There's so much in my potted history that could be dragged out and used against me.
Well, it's the same for all of us.
Absolutely. And actually, you know, I've never done drugs or anything. There's no sort of criminality there. But, you know, I've had some antidepressants. You know, I've probably screamed at my kids a couple of times. But I think that things like that really played on my mind about how what would happen if I was found to be an unfit parent? Would my kids be removed? You know, a whole myriad of things went through my mind with no sort of, I didn't, having watched it play out in court day after day, it did nothing to reassure me.
No, I think that's it. I mean, it's a terrifying experience at the best of times, I think, to actually actively be undermined and attacked by the defence barrister is...
For me as well, it was knowing what might happen to my family, that this was going to be a long, protracted, maybe 2 years of my life, and how would that affect my ability to be a mum, to work? Would my kids, I've got 6 children, would my children be sort of dragged through it at school, you know, because their mum was going through the court system? There was so many barriers to me doing it, yet, like I say, I watched in awe as other women did it.
Absolutely. We've had a question come in, and it's about someone who reported their case 17 years ago and refused an update because couldn't prove it was them calling for an update 4 years ago. And now they've been told that files wouldn't be kept that long. And asking where can I go from here as the perpetrator is deceased now. I think I would be tempted to lodge a complaint with that police force. I think that would be the way to go with that. So that they would have to then scrutinise what they've done and how they behaved. So
I do struggle to believe that records aren't kept for that long as well. As somebody, I was a midwife, so records are kept for 21 years there. So I struggle to believe that stuff isn't kept for perhaps that long.
Well, again, it varies from place to place and from police force to police force. Some for longer and others won't. And in fact, even the way in which the records are kept varies sometimes. You know, lodged under the survivor's name or lodged under the perpetrator's name.
Misfiled, lost.
So I think definitely in that case, I would report. I would make a formal complaint to the police force, and they would then have to examine what they've done.
Yeah, it would just be nice then for the person obviously who's commented to actually sort of get some closure about, okay, well, they have been destroyed, or is it just somebody not having a proper look? You never quite know, especially when there's boxes and boxes of reams and old paper files. Again.
So I think, you know, it seems like the police force does have evidence of statement and video that they had. So, you know, they really should be able to provide that information.
Yeah, and you can, as far as I'm aware, Faye, you can take, even though a perpetrator is deceased, that can still go through the court system, can't it, to actually prove an outcome? Am I right? Have I read? I'm sure I read one case that happened with.
I think it can. I think it depends on the circumstances.
Yeah.
And I think that's more likely if there's an organisation involved.
Right.
So, and that might be proving liability for an organisation, a school or a care home or whatever.
Right. Yeah, as opposed to just Joe Blogg's public.
I think it would be unusual for an individual who's been passed on to have that case carry on against them.
Yeah.
However, if you've made that report, you can put an application in for criminal injuries compensation. So it's worth doing, even if the person has passed on. It's worth making that formal report, because that's a requirement before making a claim for compensation.
Right, no, that's interesting.
Yeah, and the case doesn't have to have gone through a court to reach a verdict for you to be able to claim.
No, that's very interesting.
Yeah. It's not that they pay very much. You know?
No.
You'll be unsurprised.
I think for most survivors, it's about an acknowledgement. It's about an acknowledgement that actually this happened to me and I've been heard.
Yes.
It's not about the money. It's about actually what that money represents within a system that says, actually, okay, I have been believed.
Yeah. Well, I think lots of survivors don't want to touch compensation money with a barge pole. It feels like it's dirty money to them almost.
Yeah.
And I've spoken to survivors who've had compensation and then wanted to give it all away. And what I've said to them is, leave it aside and think about it, because you deserve it, as a way of making some sort of recompense to you for what you've been through. So sit on it a while longer and think, and maybe there is something that you can use it for that will make a difference.
Yeah, I was my father was my perpetrator, and that so I actually ended up with some money from an inheritance that I never ever believed, because I was always told he disinherited me. So my family bought a caravan. So actually we have beautiful memories now with the children. So I managed to turn it into something good, because initially I was, I'm not sure actually I want to touch that, but actually I've used it for means of good and nice memories.
That's a really good way of using it.
Yeah. So it's a bit like I win. So
yeah, absolutely, definitely. Yeah. I want to come back to the issue of the phone records again, because one of the issues is that if there is evidence of separate criminal offences, then they might be investigated by the police. And I guess what we're straying into is issues where someone might have been taking drugs, might have been, sort of communicating with other people around that. And yet again, another barrier for someone in coming forward and reporting, and not related to the way they've been raped and assaulted.
Yeah. And I think that's definitely a barrier. And I think when we know that an awful lot of survivors can turn to alcohol or drug misuse in order to actually get through a day, because obviously mental health services aren't great, that then can be another poke in the side about why not to, what if I've ordered drugs online, or what if I've texted my dealer in order to actually not come forward.
Exactly. And I think what the CPS are saying is that it's not something that they would seek out to do. However, they can't give any assurance that that's not what would happen. So
no, and that for me would be a huge worry. Like I say, not that I have taken drugs, but I've got friends who have who have turned to alcohol and drugs, and that for them would be a huge worry, that actually that would then be something else. They'd end up with another charge. Or a criminal record from something that actually was their private property, and was something that was done for all sorts of different reasons.
So I think one of the things that we have to hang on to is that actually at the moment the majority of people still aren't reporting, and that it's not essential for recovery to have reported.
No, absolutely.
And a court outcome isn't always something that brings any satisfaction or relief with it.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. For somebody who never went through a court process, actually just being able to acknowledge to myself, to speak my truth, has been so empowering. To be able to speak outwardly with other people, and actually when people say to me, what's your background? I've written a book about my experience. To be able to do that and know that perhaps that's helped a few other people to say, actually, I don't need to tell anybody else, but I am going to look in the mirror and say, actually, that's me too, is really powerful as well. Yeah. Like you say, it's not always about going through the court process or standing on a soapbox, declaring to the world and wearing a T-shirt, I'm a survivor. Sometimes it is just looking in the mirror and just knowing that actually I'm acknowledging my past, I'm acknowledging my pain, and now I can free myself slightly.
I think that's it, because so often it's the things that survivors tell themselves that are the punishments, and the things that stay with them.
The guilt and the shame and the loneliness for me. When I first started to get flashbacks. I felt like I was the only person in the world that was going through that. What I now know is that obviously, 1 in 7 children, 1 in 6 children have faced abuse, 1 in 3 women, have domestic violence. There are so many other people around us, but while we keep it so taboo, it makes it so much more difficult for people to reach out and find support with other people who have walked with us in our shoes, perhaps not exactly in our shoes, but they've walked by our side slightly.
Absolutely. And thinking about the support that is out there as well. And it's really important, I think, always to acknowledge the role of specialist voluntary sector services in what they deliver.
Absolutely.
And the way they campaign and promote the needs of survivors and try to meet those needs as much as ever they can. Without that, I don't think we would have recognisable services for survivors in this country.
No, I agree. And I think the voluntary sector now picks up such a lot of mainstream that's been cut because of various budget cuts and changes. And that for me is huge when you look at the voluntary sector.
Absolutely. So yes, I mean, we've seen cutbacks in mental health services and community services, so that that level of support for people just isn't there. And it's the most vulnerable. It's the most vulnerable ones who feel that the most.
Yeah, and for me, as looking at the holisticness of it, actually, the more care, the more love, the more gentleness we can give, and the more support, actually, the long-term outcomes, the cost to the NHS, the cost to families, is so much less. The moment we sort of offer up support, but obviously I think the voluntary agencies are taking up so much slack, and often are trying to do much more than they're able to, bless them, because of just the restraints on time and staff and money.
Exactly. We know that for every pound that a voluntary sector service is given, they make it stretch 5, 6 times further than anyone else could, and they absolutely make the most of it. So I think, in terms of this conversation and in terms of thinking about the way survivors have to battle themselves to decide whether to report, and then battle the system when they eventually get there. It's ongoing, isn't it? And how do we tackle that? It feels like we need really to organise ourselves to make these changes and to push through changes that will bring a different system.
I think there's changes at a real strategic level that are, sort of governmental and with the police, and then there's changes within our society as well that actually that we're not victim blaming and shaming, that it is okay to speak out. My children have been brought up in an arena where they are allowed to speak out if something troubles them or worries them. I will always believe them. And unfortunately, my experience with other survivors is that where they've tried to tell somebody, they've been shooed away, don't be so ridiculous, and they've never told another soul, because that obviously that first time that they tried to tell somebody, it didn't work, and that's set with them for the rest of their life, which again is so sad.
Exactly. It's why we have to make sure that the barriers that are there are minimised as much as ever they can, and that we make that process as easy as ever it possibly can be.
Yeah, I think for young people as well, the use of social media to sort of say to them that actually there is no shaming coming forward. And I only ever wanted stuff logged with the police, and I wanted stuff just put on record, but I was always I don't want anything done with it just yet. I might at a later date, and as various stuff cropped up around over the years, I just logged more and more stuff. And then never did anything with it. And I think that's okay for survivors to know that we can do that. And the likelihood of the police obviously trying to do a victimless prosecution, it's fairly low in that case. That's always an avenue. That sometimes it is just about saying to somebody, "This has happened to me."
So I'm just looking at some of the comments that are coming in, and We've got comments around societal change is the key, and absolutely support that. And another comment about we could do with professions supporting peers to support peers, and absolutely, and we do see that happening in our member agencies, where survivor-focused, survivor-led groups are providing peer support.
Yeah, that's huge.
It's massive, and I think it brings a very different perspective to that relationship.
Yeah, I think the ability to say to somebody that who's perhaps just starting out on their journey with either disclosing or, you know, having been a survivor of sexual assault, to somebody who is perhaps, I don't know, much further way down the line of healing, it can be so empowering to see that you can move through that. You can get from A to B, even though you feel like at the time like you're treading in treacle and you're never going to feel back to the person that you were perhaps meant to be, but looking at somebody else and having them cheering you on is huge.
It's at the heart of empowering people, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Think, you know, some statutory services you go to are not empowering. The whole process is disempowering, even, where you're made to feel like someone who has to have something done to them. There's no choice around what happens, and the whole process that you go through is not designed to build your confidence or make you feel better about yourself.
Yeah, I was told once that I should be much more broken than I was, given what had happened to me. And I just looked at somebody and said, "Are you for real?" You know, actually, I give a very good aura of not being not now broken. But it was a GP who just said to me, and I just, how can you possibly say that to me? But where does that come from? That whole sort of arena of you should be more broken. And again, society says that if we've experienced sexual violence, that must break us, but it doesn't always have to. You know, it can be part of us, but we can choose to react however we choose to react.
Well, exactly, and it's all part of putting people into a box and thinking that they have to behave in a particular way, and if they don't, then they aren't a survivor, or maybe something didn't happen to them. That doubt and believing, it's a really strong drive, I think, in a lot of people, not wanting to accept that this can happen.
I think when we look at the reasons for survivors not reporting, I'm sure you, in one of your things, you say how many 25% of the police not believing them is a reason for people not reporting, but also your peer group, your family not believing you and holding on to the fact that, well, why have you left it so long? You know, why have you left it 2 weeks? Why have you left it 2 years, 20 years before you told anybody? Again, people not knowing the dynamics of, well, actually, sometimes that's just what happens. Sometimes we bury stuff. Sometimes we choose not to acknowledge it. There is a whole myriad of reasons why we choose to do whatever it is we do at the time. And then that, for me, has been very pertinent to my journey, having not been believed and being called a liar, because I chose to stay within my family unit for so many years and not make a fuss. Because the moment I did make a fuss and actually say this has happened, I was sort of thrown out and cast aside, and that can be really tough when you're then feeling like an island.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a huge cost in a survivor reaching that decision to disclose and tell, and I don't think that can be minimised at all.
No.
And families very often aren't supportive, sadly. You know, so in addition to battling their own feelings about what's happened, you know, that rejection from family is a massive issue too.
Yeah, I know a lot of the women that I work alongside say I'd expected them to kind of love me more or to feel more sorry for me, and actually when that doesn't happen, the letdown that somebody feels from those people around them, it can be huge. It can almost be as destructive as what they've gone through. And again, it's like the icing on the cake of horribleness that somebody has to experience that. So I'm always quite wary of saying to somebody, you know, before you go and tell other people, let's just consider how this might play out.
I think that's a really good point. Thinking about what you want to achieve and where you want to go, what you want to happen, because what happens next might not be what you anticipated. And sometimes that can be in a good way and you get a positive response, but it's not guaranteed, is it?
Yeah, and I think the knowing that we can't always control other people, the only person we can control is ourselves and our emotion. We can't often tell others how they might react or how they should react to our news, to our experience.
Absolutely. And now I'm just looking, we've had a question come in about providing training to peer lead support networks and looking for free training. Well, I think there is something that we would absolutely love to do. We still need it to be funded to do it, sadly. You know, there's still a cost for us involved, but would absolutely want to roll that out for people. There are a lot of survivors out there who want to make a difference and want to use what's happened to them in a positive way. And for me, the survivors who do that are, you know, the heart and soul of making a difference for survivors. You know, it's driven by that personal experience. It makes such a difference, I think, to that motivation and understanding of what difference it makes.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah, and I'm just seeing a comment around, you know, you have to be in charge of what happens moving forward for yourself, and sometimes, you know, you have to leave family behind, and that's you know, that's just how it is. And
yeah, I think that can be a very bitter pill to swallow. I know that took me personally a very long time to come to that decision that actually I can't change your opinion. Those are your opinions, and that can be very different when two people have a very different experience of a perpetrator, especially if the perpetrator is known to them, which is where my background has come from, in that my experience was very different to that of other people's. And it doesn't mean that they're wrong. It doesn't mean I'm wrong. I've just had to accept this is my truth. I know my truth. This is your truth, and I respect that. But actually, if we can't talk about it, then, and we can't be civil, then actually we have to just move aside, and that's okay. And I've learned to live with that, and it settles well with me now.
I think you know, for me, when you're talking like that, it's what you're describing is that fire that survivors have to walk through to get to the other side, and actually, you know, take on board the weight of the experiences they've had. But you can get through that fire and get to the other side. I think that's the positive thing. And for me, it's not necessarily about a court case. It's not always. In fact, definitely not always necessary for that to happen. For someone to heal and recover, that personal power is in there no matter what, and a court
I agree.
isn't going to change that.
Yeah, no, I absolutely believe that within us all we have much more magnificence and power than we've ever believed, and that once we can sort of come through, and I know people say don't look backwards, but sometimes we do have to look backwards to see just how far we've come, especially in our early days of disclosing or moving through, you know, reporting, that actually those little tiny baby steps amount to huge, great big marathons. And it's okay to change. That's what I've learned. It's okay to change. It's okay to put barriers in. I'm much more barriered and boundaried now, perhaps not barriered, but much more boundaried with my personal time, my personal space, the people I spend my time with. And that, again, that's not a bad thing. But the moment I started putting in barriers, I was labelled difficult, which is a whole nother debate. But again, you know, as somebody who's looking, perhaps, you know, where can I go with my journey? You know, boundaries are okay. Boundaries are
fine and actually necessary.
Absolutely.
and for me, that's why it's okay for survivors to be saying, I don't know if I want to give you my phone.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's okay to challenge. We're often, especially my generation, are taught you have to respect the police and you have to be, you have to sort of say yes to whatever it is they want. But actually, you are allowed to say no. You can choose to say, I am not giving you my phone. And I don't have to justify why on that form. I don't have to say why I'm not doing it. I just choose not to. And I'm okay with that.
Just thinking how interesting it might be if everyone suddenly decided to say, no, I'm not.
I choose not to. I think there was some sort of revolt there. We might be labelled as very bad human beings.
Yeah, maybe.
But I think it's worth people knowing that just because it's a police officer asking for their phone, that they are allowed to say no. They are allowed to decline whatever it is they choose to decline. Whether or not somebody's in a uniform or is a doctor, that's okay. Quite often, especially if we've been through, sexual abuse that's been over a protracted period of time, our sense of self-worth is such that when we're told somebody's in a position of authority, that actually we have to say yes, and we don't. And the first time I remember saying no to somebody, I was like, where did that voice come from? And now I say no a lot more.
It's a good lesson.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a great one for survivors to know that, you can choose not to hand over your phone. You can choose at any point in the process to say, actually, this isn't what I thought it would be. Actually, hands up, I'm out, I'm done.
Yeah, that's right. And to be honest, it may not be the right thing for that survivor. Going through that whole process may not really be healthy for them.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone should feel that they have a responsibility to have to go through that.
Yeah,
If it's
absolutely.
not good for them and it's not going to help them, then be kind to yourself and do what feels best for you, and you'll get the best result for you.
Yeah, it's going into stuff for me with eyes wide open, knowing that actually if we choose to report to the police, this is the process that will happen. This is what will, you will be asked for your phone. You might end up having to give evidence on a stand with a defence barrister who is not sympathetic and kind and nice and fluffy. That could play out. And again, peer support is huge. Having that peer support of other women, other men who've been through the court system and can say, actually, this is what happened. I'm not sure whether I do it again, but I'm here to listen to your worries is huge.
And I think what you say about choice is absolutely crucial, and it has to be informed. It has to be with all the information provided around. This is the process. This is what might happen. This is what. This is how you may feel going into that process, so that someone can make that decision for themselves. And one of the things that we've always said at Survivors Trust is that we won't actively encourage someone to report. However, if they choose to report, then we will support them all the way. And the reason why we don't encourage people to report is because of the personal cost. It has to be a really informed personal choice about whether it's something that's right for them to go through, whether it's appropriate, and that can only be a personal.
Yeah, I remember a friend of mine saying to you, you should report this to the police. And that should then is quite a portioning of blame, that actually you have a duty. A friend of mine said, you have a duty to report this to the police. And we had a bit of a stand-up argument because I just said to her, I can't do that. I hear what you're saying, but I can't do that. Well, you're being irresponsible. Look at your position. You should be doing this. You should know better, is what I was kind of told. But actually, a choice, because it's about I could do that, not I should do that, and I choose to do it. It's the empowerment of our language that we often choose to use to ourselves.
Exactly, and I think when someone's saying, you should, or it's, you have a responsibility or a duty, you have a responsibility to yourself and a duty to yourself, and you're no use to anyone else if you've forced yourself through a process that actually has broken you.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. No, I think that's so vital in where people go with their choice. And like you say, you know, the mobile phone thing is just another layer for somebody to battle through on their could I, should I, do I choose not to report?
Yeah.
It's another consideration.
Absolutely. I think as well, we also have to remember that there are people who go through that process and actually feel vindicated, and they give evidence that, you know, there is a result that they feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
And it works for them. And it might not be as many people as we'd like it to be, but those cases are there.
Yeah. And that there are really good police officers who work damn hard to get a result, you know, to get somebody the result that they want. And for some people, the closure is knowing that somebody is behind bars or that there's a guilty verdict, because it gives them validation of what they've been through. It is horses for courses, and there is no right or wrong.
No, exactly. And, you know, there are an awful lot of really dedicated police officers out there who are, you know, they're working their very best to bring people to justice. You know, we should acknowledge that, you know, that for some people the system does have an outcome that they're happy with. It's just flawed in so many respects that for most people, it can't really deliver.
Yeah, no, I think that it's down to campaigning. Obviously, things have moved along so far, but there's so much more work to be done at the strategic level, at the law level.
I think so.
Before things get changed.
Exactly. So we've had so many changes in terms of providing support for people, and, you know, introducing the Sexual Offences Act in 2003 to sort of make changes to the law. It actually hasn't resulted in more people being convicted. So we need something different. We need a system overhaul and a rethink of exactly how we manage and respond to this.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree.
Yeah, and we've had one comment posted up around an offence that happened a long time ago, and how do you survive that trauma over the years? You know, how do you cope with that? I mean, whenever a sexual offence happened, it can still be reported to the police. It doesn't matter how many decades afterwards, you can still make that report. I think in terms of coping with the trauma of that, I would absolutely be seeking out specialist support, looking on the Survivors Trust website, Rape Crisis England and Wales, Male Survivors Partnership. Look on those websites and find specialist agencies nearby and make contact with them, because it's never too late. It is never too late for things to be different or to feel different.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, again, it's not that about how long ago it happened. It's just the fact that it's happened. And to even put a comment on here is hugely, to acknowledge that to yourself is huge.
It's massive. It really is. And I do hope that they will seek out a support service near to them. And
for me, one of the biggest steps in acknowledging my past was actually making the phone call to the Rape and Sexual Abuse Centre to ask for counselling. And I picked up the phone and I put it down. I picked it up, put it down for about a month, and then eventually it was answered on the first ring. And I was quite shocked. Oh, I've got to speak now. And then actually I cancelled 2 appointments, so I was really lucky they kept me on, because again, it's just a fear of, what am I getting myself into? This feels uncomfortable. But knowing that those services are out there is hugely empowering. But also knowing that there can be a waiting list sometimes for services, and again, you know, sometimes employers offer counselling services, but again, that sometimes demands of us that we have to disclose stuff perhaps not we're comfortable with.
Absolutely, and I think there are very often waiting lists, but sometimes just knowing that that's there, that your name is there, and waiting, and using the helplines as well. And there's very often text and email support on offer as well.
Yeah.
So all of those sources of support, I think, are useful and helpful.
I think those are absolutely empowering. I know a lot of people, it's the dead of the night, the quiet moments, the times when you're really just too quiet and your brain starts to go into massive overdrive, that we start to sort of, you know, go back through our past, things that have happened, and that can be when the support lines are so useful, to know that somebody will pick up at 2-3 a.m. You're not, you know, you're not an island on your own. Exactly.
I mean, in fairness, I think there aren't many helplines that are open at that time. I think that there are a number, small number. So, you know, I keep reaching out is my suggestion until you find.
Oh, the Samaritans 24/7. They are.
Samaritans are 24/7. Yes.
Yeah, I think Women's Aid, I think their national helpline is 24/7 as well.
And also the helpline in Wales, the domestic and sexual violence helpline, Live Fear Free, is called, just being reminded. So the Live Fear Free helpline is open, and they'll take calls from anywhere. That's open. Yeah,
I think sometimes just having those phone numbers to hand as well, even though perhaps we might feel like we might not need it today, knowing that actually on a moment of crisis when we are at rock bottom, we've got that number to hand, again, can be hugely empowering. It's part of building our arsenal and our support network, and also empowering ourselves.
Exactly. And you think you have to think of it in those terms. It's getting your armour on, getting all your helplines ready, or your sources of support, and looking after yourself.
Yeah, and acknowledging, I used to spend a lot of time feeling guilty for actually feeling quite crap. And then would have a good chat with myself and actually just think, actually, no, I'm allowed to feel like this, actually, given what I've been through. I don't have to always feel top dollar tickety-boo with a smile on my face. There are days when actually I don't have to feel like that. I can choose how I feel. If I choose to be happy, then I can. But if I choose to be quiet and, you know, actually go back through my past, then I can choose that as well. There is no right or wrong.
No, and it's okay to feel sad when, you know, when bad things have happened to you. It's okay
absolutely.
To feel like that. It's normal to do that.
Yeah, you know, part of the sadness, the anger, the grief, the guilt, all the emotions that we feel, every one of them is there. You know, it's there, and it's a feeling. We can acknowledge it, and we can choose how long it stays with us, or we can choose, you know, to work through it and you know, come out the other side.
Absolutely. And I'm going to be thinking about your caravan now, because it just embodies what you can do in terms of turning something around and changing it and creating a different feeling about something.
Yeah, that for me has been the moment I changed my mind, not my mindset, but the way I thought about my past, was the opening the door for me. That the writing of my book, that enabled me then to say, actually, I'm shedding that past. I have no shame. It's not written to blame anybody, but what it can do is offer a voice to other people, which is what it does do. The same as the caravan. Actually, I could look at it as dirty guilt money, but actually it's a thing of beauty. And I'm off tomorrow to Woolacombe in North Devon to spend the weekend paddleboarding. So there is a gift there. So again, it's perspective. We can choose how we look upon something.
Yeah. Well, I think that's absolutely a perfect point for us to realise that we've reached the end.
It's an hour, golly me.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Danny.
No, you too, Faye.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts and sharing with us.
No, thank you.
Okay, what I'd like to remind everyone to look after themselves, and if you need support, do get on the helplines. We'll be posting them up on the list. Thank you for all the comments, and take good care.
Thank you.